Hi guys, this is just a quick sidebar ahead of the main content on today's video, which is all around land management techniques, and it ties into that quite well. It's a piece of good news, or rather it could be. We'll have to wait until 2028 to find out. It's the Path to Sustainable Farming that's just been launched by the government this week. It's a roadmap supporting the agricultural bill, and it introduces some of what we might come to expect from the next 7 years of agriculture. So Brexit is an unmitigated disaster, but one of the few good things that might be able to come out of it is this bill. The EU's Common Agricultural Policy didn't really work for anyone, and hopefully under the right stewardship this bill can reform the way we look at agriculture and create agriculture that not only is more sustainable and produces more, but also works alongside wildlife, alongside soil restoration, water restoration, all those other goals that are just as important. This bill is the most significant change to UK farming, or I should say English farming, because currently it's only under the jurisdiction of England. I think the other countries in the Union are free to decide whether they follow it or not, but it's the most significant change in England, certainly for the last 50 years. The central aim of it is for farmers to be sustainably producing better quality food without subsidy, while improving the environment, animal welfare and reducing carbon emissions, and that's all by that 2028 target. The key changes include the launch of an environmental land management scheme, which I'll touch on more in a second because it's probably the most important aspect of it. Also controlling and eradicating endemic diseases in livestock. The launch of a farming investment fund, which will phase out the basic payment scheme that we had under the EU. And that will provide grants for equipment, for technology, for infrastructure, all to improve the productivity of these farms, but also just to make sure that they are managed in a more sustainable and less wasteful way. So the environmental land management scheme section of this roadmap is three-pronged. The first prong being the sustainable farming incentive. That's an incentive to improve soil health, hedgerows and integrated pest management. The second prong is local nature recovery, which will pay for the creation, management and restoration of habitats, natural flood management and species management. And then the third and final one, landscape recovery, which is large-scale forest and woodland creation, peatland restoration, how important is that, and also the creation and restoration of wetlands and salt marsh on our coasts. So in short, I think it's real cause for hope, which is something that's been in short supply recently. I guess we'll have to wait until 2028 to see if it's worked properly, but I think if managed correctly, and if some of these things that they've laid out, if we realise them and are as ambitious as we can be, I think it could be a massive thing, not only for the future of UK farming, but also just for the environmental movement as a whole. Something to prove not only to people interested in the environment, but just to the general public, that environmental aims don't necessarily have to come in the way of commercial ones. And I think it's that marriage of profitability, of still making money and having an economy that creates jobs, but also works for wildlife and the environment. And if we get that right, then I think people will start to see that a green future is the only future that we can head towards. Hey guys, welcome to this video on land management techniques. The eagle-eyed amongst you may notice a wreath behind me. Made this with my partner at the weekend, so this is being filmed around Christmas. I've got my Christmas tree over here as well. There you go. And actually, quick note that I'll mention before I start on the content of the video is, so we always buy a traditional tree. After lots of research, we've decided that that's probably the best thing for the environment. But this year I will be sowing my own from seed and growing it. And the idea is to bring it in every year potted, trim it down in between times, and then put it outside for the rest of the year, so that we're not cutting down a tree every year. So I'll maybe post a video on the planting of that and show you some sort of growth progress as we go. So land management techniques. I've decided to split this video into two. I've done a fair bit of research on it, and we're going to talk about agricultural land management, we're going to talk about forestry land management, and we're going to talk about environmental land management. Now, those aren't always quite so clear cut. There's a lot of crossover in between, as you might see in this video, but because of the quantity of the things that we're going to talk about, this first video will just be on agricultural land management, and then I think I'll just do a second video which will combine forestry land management and environmental land management. So what is land management? Well, the definition of land management is the process of managing the use and development in both urban and rural settings of land resources. So either it's for human use, where we're using it for exercise, for recreation, for building, for tourism, anything like that, or we're using it for a resource. So as I've mentioned, for agriculture, for crops, for animals, for timber, there's plenty of others as well. So 70% of the UK is farmland and only 13% is forested. So it's really important, especially when you're coming at this from a biodiversity and an ecological point of view, that we manage that land correctly. There's an old adage, which I heard recently, which is, how do you improve the biodiversity of farmland? And the answer is that you build a housing estate on it, because the biodiversity of people's back gardens in a housing estate is much, much greater than, unfortunately, these enormous dead areas that we've created through modern farming practices. Around the world, we're farming more and more intensively. We are spraying pesticides and fertilizers at a colossal rate, and we're abandoning a lot of traditional farming techniques. All of the farming techniques and the traditional farming techniques and land management techniques I'm going to talk about are all for, if not for the benefit of nature, they're more natural ways of farming, I suppose, is the way you could describe it. So at the moment, like I say, the focus is entirely on productivity, which is important, but certainly since the war, probably for the last 80 years or so, there's been an enormous drop in wildlife, and a lot of that can be attributed to the way that we now approach farming. So a little note on productivity. Back in the 1940s, when farms were much more weed infested than they are now, we didn't use the same sort of techniques that we now use. A farmer would be lucky if he produced 2 tons of wheat per hectare. Nowadays, a high yielding variety of wheat a farmer would expect to harvest 10 tons of wheat per hectare. So you can see the attraction, you can see the understanding of it. But the problem is that that's after applying pesticides, it's after applying that ammonium nitrate fertilizer, sprinkling of Roundup, all of which are disastrous for the environment. And Roundup has been linked with being carcinogenic, being dreadful for human health. There's also been studies on the actual plants that we're eating and the nutrients contained within, and plants that are grown using intensive farming. The nutrient level is much, much lower than organic produced food. So there's a big argument that we're producing more food, but we're producing much lower quality food. So all of this has had a massive impact on the soil quality in the UK, and each autumn it's not uncommon for farmers to turn over really compacted soils which need to be pulverised with a power harrow before sowing can begin. Then they douse the land with these chemicals to coax forth an unwilling crop. I mentioned the book Wilding last time, Isabella Tree. That's exactly the situation that her and her husband Charlie found themselves in. Each year they were having to do more and more and more, and it was almost, one farmer when I was researching this said, it was almost as if you're fighting against nature. So on the flip side of this, in 2009 the UN Food and Agricultural Organization warned that the global population would increase by 34% by 2050. So we would have a global population of 9.1 billion people. So in order to feed this larger, more urban and richer population, food production must increase, they said, by 70%. So you can see where the driver is for these increased yields. And the problem is that the challenge that we must face is marrying up these increased production demands with environmental outcomes as well. And that isn't always easy. I've just mentioned NEP again, and the uncomfortable truth is that But if every farmer in the UK operated like that, we would have an awful lot of wildlife and not an enormous amount of food. So not everyone can follow the net model, much though I think it's a fantastic thing. We do still need high yielding farms. So how do you address that? How do you have a high yielding farm while also looking after nature? It's a complex issue. Perhaps technology is the answer. There's been a lot of talk of vertical farming in towers, or robotic farming perhaps, or the controversial subject of GM crops, or throwing away less food. A third of the food that we produce in the UK ends up in the bin, it doesn't reach the plate. So that would go quite a long way to reaching that 70% global increase if 33% of the food that we're producing doesn't even get eaten. I think it's probably quite clear that I could fill several videos talking about all the different topics just around farming alone, but we don't have several videos. We have just the one, and so we're just going to talk about those traditional land management techniques that are, like I said, if not good for the environment, they work with the environment, and they are a better way of improving the quality of the land and getting some environmental outcomes, also increasing the health of the farm without having to resort to things like pesticides, things like fertilisers. So one technique that is again linked to what they're doing over at KNEPP is conservation grazing, and this links into holistic management as well. So grazing is often the most effective and natural way to maintain certain habitats, especially grassland and heathland. It keeps areas open and it ensures a wider variety of plants and animals. Cattle and sheep tend to graze on competitive dominant species, leaving the rarer flowers and plants behind. The difficulty with this process is that it needs to be managed incredibly carefully. You need to have a really good idea of your land and the amount of animals that it can sustain, and also the amount that there's a very small tipping point between it being undergrazed and it succeeding to closed canopy woodland, and it being overgrazed, and you ending up with a situation like in Scotland, for instance, where thousands and thousands and thousands of deer are reared mainly for shoots, and there's no tree cover at all. So a lot of the next topics that I'll talk about, on the next land management techniques, are all, in part at least, designed with the idea of improving the health of soils. So we've touched on this a little bit earlier on, but why is soil so important and why is the health of soil so important? Well, it's obvious really, I suppose. Healthy soils produce healthy crops that in turn nourish the people and animals that eat those crops. Soil quality is directly linked to food quality and food quantity, like we mentioned earlier. So soils are what supply a lot of the essential nutrients, water, oxygen and root support that our food producing plants need to grow and flourish. The healthiness of the soils and the lack of compactness of those soils. Compacted soils are what leads to runoff, and you end up getting flood events, you end up getting all of the pesticides and the fertilisers that we're putting on those fields end up in water bodies, which can lead to eutrophication, and it's just not a good cycle. So the quality of the soil, not only in the nutrients it contains, but also in the actual quality of the makeup of it, is enormously important, both for the production of the farm and also for the environmental outcomes that we're looking to gain as well. Cover cropping is a technique that's used in agriculture. Cover crops are plants that are planted to cover the soil rather than for the purpose of being harvested. So they are usually planted after you've harvested your main crop, and rather than leaving the soils bare after that until you sow again, they manage soil erosion, soil fertility, soil quality, water, weeds, pests, diseases, and they also provide a space for biodiversity and wildlife in that period where you haven't got any plants on the land. So an example of these would be black oats are a very popular way of doing this in the UK. So another thing that we'll talk about here is no-till or minimum till. So like I mentioned at the start, a lot of farming involves the ploughing up of these fields and really trying to make sure those soils aren't compacted. They plough them up in the autumn, they pulverise them just so that they're then ready for the next growing season. There has been studies to suggest that actually this ploughing process compacts the soils further. So there is a method of farming called no-till farming, and it's also known as zero tillage or direct drilling. It's an agricultural technique for growing crops or pasture without disturbing the soil, and it decreases the amount of soil erosion, which tillage causes in certain soils, especially in sandy and dry soils or on sloping terrain. So all around it helps to preserve soil integrity. Many of you may have heard of the next two methods. They are crop rotation and fallowing. So crop rotation, what's that? Crop rotation is the practice of growing a series of different types of crops in the same area across a sequence of growing seasons. And it's something you may find if you know anyone who's a keen gardener, especially a vegetable gardener, they will probably do this. It reduces the reliance on one set of nutrients, pest and weed pressure, and the probability of developing resistant pests and weeds. So in short, if you are planting the same thing in the same ground year on year, it will be taking the same nutrients from the soils, and it will do nothing for the land. It's much better, much more diverse if you are changing those up for species that complement each other. So fallowing. If you have ever been to Glastonbury Festival, you'll be familiar with this term, a fallow year, a term for a year off, if you like. Fallowing in farming, it's a technique in which arable land specifically is left without sowing for one or more vegetative cycles. The goal of fallowing is to allow that land to recover and to store organic matter while retaining moisture and disrupting the life cycles of pathogens by temporarily removing their host. So really, in simple terms, think of it as just giving the land a breather for a year, allowing it to build up its stores of certain nutrients again before you're then relying on those nutrients again for your cropping season. So a controversial one next. It's not really under the bracket of farming, but the purpose of it is to provide feed, I suppose, for an animal that is then consumed. So it's heather burning. So you might have seen this on the news. Heather burning is, as the name would suggest, enormous swathes of heather which are purposefully set alight. And you might be wondering, well, why do people do that? It doesn't seem to make much sense. Well, the reason for it is that we have an enormous market in the UK for grouse and pheasant shoots, which in themselves are a bit of an ecological disaster. We breed and import millions of birds each year, which do nothing for biodiversity. Pheasants especially will just peck to death reptiles without even meaning to eat them. There's been some link between these shoots and the shooting of birds of prey, which Chris Packham was very vocal about. So yeah, the reason it's done anyway, ignoring those issues, is you burn back old heather, and the heather then regenerates. It grows new green shoots which are eaten by grouse and pheasants, which are reared specifically for these hunts. Terracing. Terracing, something that you might more closely associate with probably Southeast Asia. It's where you've taken a mountainous or a hilly area and you've split it into terraces. I'll get a picture up to show you. And again, the reason that it's done is a lot to do with the soil, a lot to do with drainage. So really it's just so that farming's more effective. It also makes accessing the land much more effective. You stop runoff because you've created these flat areas, and it also means that you can use certain types of machinery because you've flattened out the land that you wouldn't be able to use on a slope. So as well as the sort of land itself that you're farming, there's a lot of land management on farms on the surrounding land, if you like. So some of the techniques that are utilised and some of the techniques that are funded were funded under the EU legislation and will be, by the looks of it, under our new legislation that I talked at the very start of the video, are set-aside areas, buffer strips, hedgerows and field margins, which are all really versions of the same thing. So set-aside areas were originally used to reduce production, funnily enough, when we were producing too much. They were paid for under EU farming regs, and they were exactly what they said on the tin, areas of land set aside and not farmed, but managed in a way that they could be brought back to farmland. And they're really important for biodiversity. It's the sort of thing, which I'll touch on in a bit with the hedgerows, that you would have seen farms doing decades and decades ago in the early parts of the 20th century. Buffer strips are an area of land maintained in permanent vegetation that helps to control air, soil and water quality, specifically water quality and soil quality, really. Are most commonly used to slow the runoff of soil into water bodies, and they absorb some of the pollutants from the farming fields themselves, so that they don't then reach those water bodies. Not only that, they also provide in themselves an area, a small tract of land beside the farmer's field for plants and wildlife. So hedgerows are great for wildlife, fantastic for biodiversity. They're also in place because they provide shelter for stock and crops and cut down wind speed onto those fields, which prevents erosion, again protecting that soil health. So many of these techniques come back to the soil. And many farmers have kept them, again, to touch back on our old friends, the pheasants and the grouse, because pheasants and grouse use them for shelter and for food. Unfortunately, as larger machinery has been used, hedgerows have been taken out, so fields that would have been, 100 metres by 100 metres have now been combined with other fields around them until you have these super fields, which these enormous pieces of machinery can then plough up. Their turning circle is greater, so you end up with less hedgerows. So just to illustrate this, it's been estimated that we lose around 10,000 miles of hedgerow a year in the UK, which is an enormous quantity. So there's an interesting bit of history related to this. It all started in the war. So productivity was seen as key, dig for victory, all this sort of stuff. And during the Second World War, the area of arable land in the UK doubled, which is incredible in that short a period of time. It also did an interesting thing to change the public psyche, and suddenly unused agricultural land, or unused land in general, was almost seen as offensive. There was this big drive for self-sufficiency, for being able to feed the nation, and unfortunately it resulted in a lot of the sort of set-aside areas that we talked about before and hedgerows being destroyed. And not only that, post-war, obviously there was rationing, so we were still keen on getting that food production up, but even after that, when we didn't need it so much, it was almost as if the whole thinking of the nation had changed, and that productivity was seen almost as a thing of national pride. So the next thing is intercropping, push-pull systems. So intercropping, again, it's one of those things that describes exactly what it does. It's the cultivation of two or more crops simultaneously on the same field. The most common goal of that intercropping is to produce a greater yield on a given piece of land by making use of resources or ecological processes that would otherwise not be utilised by a single crop. And that's where the push-pull systems is really a similar thing. It's an intercropping strategy for controlling agricultural pests by using repellent push plants and trap pull plants. Like many symbiotic relationships in nature, it's two plants that provide different ecological outcomes that farmers then use intelligently together in order to bring benefits to both sets of plants. So the final thing we'll touch on is water. So that's water conservation, but also drip irrigation, raised beds, tide ridges, ditches, grass filter strips. really a lot of this goes back again to soil quality. It goes back to not having flooding on your fields, and it goes back to making sure that you're not using more water than you need to on your farm. So a lot of the UK drainage systems in farmers' fields, which are still used to this day, are Victorian, the old pipes, and they work incredibly well still, really. Agricultural land, as we've talked about before, the soil is prone to compaction, to getting really, really dense and really, really heavily compacted, which is bad because it means that plant roots can't grow through it as easily, and it means that in times of heavy rainfall or flooding, the land can't absorb the water. It just sits on the surface, it kills your crops, and you end up with flooding issues. Ditches especially provide a valuable habitat. Again, they're often you often get a ditch and then a hedgerow beside it, with perhaps a grass strip on the other side, and that, even though it's a small tract of land, it can provide really valuable habitat. The only downside is that the very point of these ditches, as we've just said, is to allow for runoff, water runoff from the land without taking that soil with it. But the water does contain all those pesticides that potentially are being used, all those fertilisers, and that can lead to a eutrophic state. Eutrophication is where bodies of water have too many nutrients in them, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, and it often results in one type of species taking over, and the biodiversity of the water body being completely killed off. In a ditch, obviously that has a fairly minor effect because it's only a small body of water, but it's still not good for the habitat. But those ditches then lead to other runoff systems, which lead to bodies of water, and an enormous problem, which again I could do a completely different video on, is the eutrophication of our water bodies, and the catastrophic knock-on effects that then has on biodiversity, on human health sometimes if we use that water for drinking. So yeah, perhaps that's something I'll make a different video on at another time. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, part 1 on land management techniques, specifically farming land management techniques. Like I said at the head of the video, the next video is going to be more focused on forestry and on specifically ecological and environmental land management, where there is no, so forestry and farming are obviously all about producing products for humans, which we then try and mitigate the effects of the effects on nature, whereas there are also ways of managing land which are specifically just for environmental outcomes. So we'll talk about them in a bit more detail as well. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. I really enjoyed researching it, and I'll see you for part 2. See you then. Cheers guys, bye.